Yo, so guys, welcome back to another video. This is another infographic show reaction, and this one is What If World Without the US Part 1. And I just saw this pop up on my feed, and firstly, I'd be interested in doing sort of what if a world without the slash, and it'll be other countries, so the UK or England, or like all other countries around the world, if there is sort of a series on this that I could do on other countries, because I assume just off this bit alone, it's going to be to do with like things the US has done first, or inventions that they made, what the world would be like without those kinds of things. Like, for example, the US and the USSR, like during the Cold War, there was like a battle between who could get to space first, and it's just things like that. Because obviously war progresses things, and the US has been in quite a few wars, to be fair. And I mean, I say war, it's called Cold War, but it wasn't actually like a full-blown war. It was just sort of like it was just sort of just hints and sort of competing with each other and stuff like that. And again, it did help sort of accelerate the world's technology in many ways. And again, one on this to do with the UK would be interesting if there is one out there. And there is a part 2 to this as well, so I might do this part 2 straight after this one if I enjoy this video. But yeah, let's just get into this one. I don't know if I'm fully correct with what I'm guessing this video will be about, but that's just my sort of prejudgment on this. And yeah, man, let's just get into this. Hopefully you guys are going to enjoy. Links in the description for my Instagram and my Twitter, all there, just for those who want to follow those socials. And my second channel, links are there for the second channel for those who want to sub to that. But let's get into this one and let's see what the infographic show have for us today, man.
When you're popular, everyone loves to hate you. And if you're American, then you should be able to admit that throughout history, the US has done things that deserve being hated for. And if you're not American, then you should be able to admit that throughout history, the US has done
things that have helped humanity. It's a two-way thing. And that's the thing with any global superpower at the time. I mean, again, I've looked in the past, the UK, when they were back, like when they were sort of the country leading the world, I guess you could say, done some fucked up shit. And again, any other country that's sort of been a world power at the time does messed up shit, but they also help do positive things as well. It's sort of a double-edged sword in a way.
Done things that it deserves being loved for. Yet, as the world's sole superpower, the US's influence spreads around the world, in both good and bad ways. What would happen, though, if the US didn't exist anymore? Or at least if its influence across the world stage disappeared overnight? World War II ends in a stalemate. Armchair historians love to point out that the moment Hitler invaded Russia, he was doomed to failure, and thus World War II would have been won by the Allies even without the US. Yet historical truth is not quite that simple. Invading Russia was a critical mistake made by Hitler, and one worsened when the US joined the war and reopened the Western Front in Europe. Yet, what if the US had simply shrugged its shoulders?
I still find it so funny that the US and Russia were like on good terms at that point. They were like allies. It's just so funny when you consider what happened after that. Just everything just flipping changed.
When Russia and Britain begged it to join the war effort. Despite a superior fleet, Britain's war material supply was running dangerously low, even with constant American resupply efforts. Without the US to ship war goods to Britain, the best that the United Kingdom could have done is stave off a German invasion. In war games carried out in the early 2000s by a British think tank, it was discovered that Hitler could never have successfully overcome Britain's fleets, the RAF, or the Home Guard in a cross-channel invasion. Yet this war game was undertaken with constant US resupply efforts underway. Without these resupply efforts, a cross-channel invasion would probably still have been disastrous for Germany, but then again, Germany would have had little need to invade Britain without the US supplying it. A token defensive force could have been left behind in France in order to discourage British invasion, and the full might of the Wehrmacht could have been dispatched to the Eastern Front. Not just reviled as a madman and mass murderer, Stalin was also famously a very poor strategic thinker. He was so surprised by Hitler's invasion that in the years leading up to it, he had taken almost zero precautions against German hostility. To make matters worse, his political purges prior to World War II had decimated the ranks of the Red Army and eliminated most of its experienced commanders. Despite having exponentially greater numbers and firepower advantage in the Winter War of 1939 against Finland, the smaller and much more poorly equipped Finnish army managed to absolutely decimate the Red Army before overwhelming numbers alone forced a defeat. By the time of Hitler's invasion invasion of the Soviet Union, little had improved in the Red Army in the way of command and control, logistical support, or even training. When Hitler invaded, his troops quickly seized many of the Soviet Union's agricultural regions, leaving the nation to face mass starvation if it hadn't been for the US's Lend-Lease aid program to the wartime allies, providing food, raw materials, tanks, planes, ammunition, clothing.
That's true, actually. The supplies from the US, I've learned about it, and I remember seeing in past videos, they supplied the UK. That's how they got, not how they got rich, but that's one of the ways that the US got rich. Was that in World War I or World War II? World War II. World One. World War I or World War II? I think it was World War II no, it was World War One where they supplied the countries. I'm actually getting it mixed up. But by supplying the countries, they got rich as hell, but they also helped the countries like the UK and Russia, I guess you could say. But they also helped like with the soldiers too, so it was like a two-way thing. They helped supply, but they also helped with extra soldiers and like, yeah, just backing up the boys, as I would say, the boys, the UK and Russia, come on, and France, and just the boys, you know what I mean?
And everything in between. The United States provided critical aid to the Soviet Union in its most desperate hour. American raw materials fueled Soviet factories that churned out tanks, and thousands of Studebaker trucks helped move goods around the nation and its troops to the front lines. Warm winter clothing kept Soviet soldiers from freezing to death,
wow,
and
even
American
clothing.
rations fed both soldiers and civilians alike. As Soviet General Georgy Zhukov said after World War II, "We didn't have explosives, gunpowder. We didn't have anything to charge our rifle cartridges with. The Americans really saved us with their gunpowder and explosives. And how much sheet steel they gave us. How could we have produced our tanks without American steel? But now they make it seem as if we had an abundance of all that. Without American trucks, we wouldn't have had anything to pull our artillery with." Immediately after the invasion of the Soviet Union, the United States gave the nation an interest-free loan of $1 billion, or about...
Oh shit, an interest-free loan. So that means they wouldn't have to pay more when the longer it takes to pay the loan, the more they'd have to pay. They just have to pay the exact amount. Maths with Thurston, yeah, come on. Or maths with Luca, not Thurston. But that's crazy again. Like that shows that they were actually quite close, and they were willing to help each other out.
About 17 points.
It's crazy. I know I said this. It's just crazy how these things turn, and then they just ended up being the biggest enemies that possibly any countries have ever been in, like the history of like wars and stuff.
$5 billion in today's dollars.
Maybe
worth
actually
of
not.
supplies and raw materials. The United Kingdom was also given an initial lease of between 40 and 50 destroyers. Per the terms of the Lend-Lease, the materials were lent for the duration of the war and expected to be returned or reimbursed only upon war's end if they were kept for civilian use. Any combat losses would not be expected to be repaid. Basically, the US lent the Allies surplus military equipment under the condition that it didn't have to be repaid for unless it was kept after the war was over. In total, the US gave the Soviet Union 44,000 Jeeps, 375,883 trucks, 8,071 tractors, 12,700 tanks, 1,541,590 blankets, 331,066
Bet it was vodka, right? It must have been
liters
vodka.
of alcohol.
It's actually, imagine if it was like the US. Like, where is the whole vodka thing like sort of stem from? Like Russians loving vodka. I'll tell you what. I'm thinking like imagine the US sort of stemmed that stereotype, but I actually want to know. Is it because it keeps you warm? Because like the starch in it, because it's like made from potatoes. How Russians began. I didn't say that right. Drinking. Slow over time. Didn't want to provide. Enjoy some pickles, mushrooms. Oh, I want to know like when did Russia invent vodka? 14th century. Oh my days! They've been down in that Smirnoff Ice since the 14th century. God damn. Fair enough.
15,417,000 pairs of military boots, 106,893 tons of cotton, 2,670,000 tons of petroleum products and fuel, and 4,478,000 tons of food. It's clear that without the US, the best the Allies could have hoped for would have been a stalemate. with Germany holding on to the richest parts of the Soviet Union and expelling Britain off the mainland. No European Union. Immediately after the end of the Second World War,
it's crazy that's called the European Union, but it's because of the US
Europe found itself in shambles. Nearly all of its financial and industrial networks had been destroyed in the fierce fighting, and entire national economies had collapsed. The war had been the most devastating in human history, and the fate of entire nations hung by a thread. 2.5 years after the end of fighting, there was very little sign of recovery from the European mainland, with millions of homeless and out of work. Then, in 1948, the U.S. Secretary of State, George C. Marshall, drafted up a 4-year plan meant to reinvigorate the European economy. The plan would rely on $15 billion of financial aid, or $250 billion in today's dollars, and it would be completely financed by the American taxpayer. The first target of the Marshall Plan, as it came to—
What? Oh my days. I didn't realize they had that kind of influence on like Europe and the world. That's crazy. Taxpayers had to help fund Europe. You're my Americans from the 1940s and 1950s. Respect to you, man, because maybe it's thanks to you that I'm living this good life. You know that? You're like, genuinely, it could be the case. That's wild, though. I did not have a clue that would be the case. The taxpayers,
to be known, would be feeding the European population, as a massive famine was threatening the mainland. Thus, food aid was immediately dispatched to 16 European nations. The Soviet Union and its satellite states had been offered assistance as well, but it had turned it down due to fears of meddling by the US in internal affairs. The main focus of the Marshall Plan was on the recovery of Europe's largest industrial powers, such as West Germany, France, and Great Britain, as it was believed that if these great economies were jump-started, then the effects would spread to other nations. Attempts to rebuild national shipping fleets, road and railway infrastructure, and reconstruct devastated cities were bolstered by American aid money, though the effect of the Marshall Plan is likely less economic and more political. Due to the Soviet Union's refusal to partake in any reconstruction efforts, the Marshall Plan and the 16 nations it aided helped establish the political framework for what post-World War II Europe would look like, with the West firmly aligned in solidarity against the communist East. The Marshall Plan seeded the idea of European unity and fostered an intertwining of European interests, which was President Truman's greatest goals, as only a unified Europe could stand against the Soviet Union. But also, only a unified Europe could avert another world war. Without the Marshall Plan, European economies would have taken longer to recover than they did, which would have made them more vulnerable to political revolutions fostered by the Soviet Union, whose agents were constantly at work attempting to make the ideology of Soviet revolution abroad or of spreading communist revolutions around the world a reality. The Marshall Plan, however, also laid down the political and economic roots for what would become the European Union. And without it, it's very likely that Europe would have returned to the old power way of thinking that had dominated European politics for centuries. European colonialism prevails. Prior to World War II, European powers retained colonies across the world, and upon entering the Second World War, President Roosevelt made it extremely clear to the Allies that America's help was dependent on the eventual liberation of the majority of these colonial holdings. With their feet to the fire, Britain and France were forced to agree, and after the end of the war, President Truman made it a top priority to ensure that Britain and France, as well as other European powers, held true to their promises to begin liberating their colonies. Though the process was slow, the end of colonialism was much the result of the economic collapse of Europe's great powers, as it was the sheer determination of American presidents to see Europe relinquish its old ways. Without the United States, European colonialism would have continued.
When you deep it, Europe is just an absolute fuckery, man. All these nations are like 90% of all chaos in the world has come from Europe, and it'll be in between European countries fighting themselves, or colonizing other countries, or just like starting wars. All these different things, especially back in the day. Maybe nowadays it's a lot different, and it is a lot better. I feel like it's one of those sort of things that's changed a lot. But back in the day, man, you just look at the history and you realize like Europe was an absolute mess, to say the least, bro. And now you got things like the European Union and like NATO, which isn't obviously Europe, but it's still a lot of European countries involved. And it's just like, it's crazy how things change. And again, it's all like, not all, but a lot of it is US influence helping us. And like, changing the ways of how it was before, right?
Continued, and may in fact have worsened. With their economies in shambles, European powers would have leaned even harder on their colonial states, bleeding their economies dry in an effort to rebuild themselves. This would have sparked violent insurgencies around the world, which would have brought with them harsh crackdowns by the colonial powers. In the end, the death of European colonialism would have taken decades more to arrive, and the world today may in fact look a lot more like it did during the age of the great powers. Korea unified under the North, and Japan rises as an imperial power once more. Today, South Korea is a vibrant and prosperous nation, while its neighbor to the north is facing mass starvation and economic desolation. Yet the entire Korean peninsula would look very different today if it were not for the US. 2 days after the start of the war, the UN published Resolution 83, urging UN members to lend military aid to the South. A UN coalition force was ultimately formed, but it was the US that would do the heavy lifting. The war would end 3 years later after China's involvement, with the US not desiring to see the situation evolve into another major war that would now include China. If the US had not been available to defend the South, the war would have been won by the North far too quickly for the UN to marshal a sizable military response, and the entire peninsula would have been reunited under the North. Communism would have overtaken the South, and while we may be tempted to compare the fate of a communist peninsula with that shared by the North today, it's important to remember that the state of the North's economy is largely the result of US-led sanction efforts against the Kim regime. Without the US to lead these sanctions and under the protection of a growing China, the unified Korean peninsula would be in a stronger economic state than the North is today. If it would have been more prosperous than South Korea is today is debatable, but what isn't is that a communist Korea wouldn't necessarily be as impoverished as the North is today. A communist Korea would have naturally gravitated toward China and become a satellite state. This would have upended Asian politics as we understand them today. Japan, for one, would have been quick to ditch its pacifist ideologies, which were only ever truly possible as a result of Japan enjoying the protection of the United States. Faced with a hostile China, Japanese nationalistic hardliners would have upended the constitution and rewritten it to allow Japan to once more field a military capable of both offensive and defensive operations.
Jeez.
Even today, Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is a member of a right-wing nationalistic party, which in the past advocated a return to imperial power. Japan would have risen as a military power once more, and conflict in Asia would be all but unavoidable. The second half of the 20th century would have been dramatically different without US intervention, and it's likely that communism would have dominated the global stage both militarily and politically, whereas today we live in a world of mostly strong democratic states. We could in fact have seen a reverse of this, with the world as we know it being made up of a collection of communist states where the democracies are the minority. What would that have meant for global civil rights movements? We can only guess, but in part 2, we'll take a look at how the world may have looked as it entered the 21st century in a world without the US. What do you think would have happened?
I've really enjoyed these videos, man. Like sort of ones that explain the influence of certain countries, in this case the US, and the help it has given to the world. Again, there's always like these negative things on the news and stuff, but when you see this kind of stuff, it makes you realise there's a lot of positive as well. A lot of positive. And like when you're like a superpower, a global superpower, again, people always look at, I mean people from other countries will always look at sort of just the things, they'll be like, oh, they're involved in too many wars, or they're involved in too many countries and all this kind of stuff. But I don't know, I feel like it is a way to sort of keep peace throughout the world. And it is a way to keep peace throughout the world. And you see like how the wars in the last 8 years are like at an all-time low, like since like they sort of wars started happening in humanity, which they've always been happening, but they're at an all-time low. It's like the something peace. I always forget what it's called. The 100-year peace or whatever it's called. Oh, fuck, I don't know. Not 100 year because the war was happening. But you know what I'm trying to say. Maybe it's not 8 years. Maybe it's like 30 years. I don't know. It's like something like that. But it's just, yeah, you do see it obviously has benefited the world. Not just the US, the world. And probably the US as well, right? You can't argue that. It probably has benefited the US just as much as it's benefited the world. But I'm not here to complain, man. Maybe I'm living how I am now because of this kind of influence. And I'm living like comfortable. The country I live in is safe and all this different stuff. Childish Gambino would never release This Is America. Underrated comment. Underrated comment. If America wasn't there, then the aliens wouldn't have a place to attack. What I thought after seeing this title, well, Canada will probably become a continent. USA collapses Imperial Japan. It's time. American history would be a lot easier. USA doesn't exist. Everything after American Revolution is different. When you are giving alcohol to Soviet Union, you know they are suffering. Soviet Union, my time has come. If America was never a thing in the comment, this comment wouldn't exist now. It's actually a shout, you know. Hopefully the second one he touches more upon like things they've created. I don't know if looking off that the thumbnail, I assume it's not, but I hope it's sort of touching more upon like their inventions and things that maybe wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the US, because I'd definitely be down to see more things like that. And if it's not, maybe in future I could see like a video that sort of talks about inventions from the US and just things like that. But let me know in the comments if you would like to see that. But yeah, until next time, like, subscribe, and peace.